Hi, Grandma here reading Call of the Wild by Jack London, and we're beginning with chapter 6 for the love of a man. If you recall, Buck's team fell through the ice. Fortunately, Buck had been rescued by a man named John Thornton, and we're going to learn a lot more about John Thornton. When John Thornton froze his feet the previous December, his partners had made him comfortable and left him to get well, going on themselves up the river to get out a raft of saw logs for Dawson. He was still limping slightly at the time he rescued Buck, but with the continued warm weather, even the slight limp left him. And here, lying by the riverbank through the long spring days, watching the running water, listening lazily to the songs of birds and the hum of nature, Buck slowly won back his strength. A rest comes very good after one has traveled 3,000 miles, and it must be confessed that Buck waxed lazily as his wounds healed. His muscles swelled out, and the flesh came back to covering his bones. For that matter, they were all loafing. Buck, John Thornton, and Skeet and Nig, waiting for the raft to come that was to carry them down to Dawson. Skeet was a little Irish setter who early made friends with Buck, who was in a dying condition, unable to resent her first advances. She had the doctor trait, which some dogs possess, and as a mother cat washes her kittens, so she washed and cleaned Buck's wounds. Regularly, each morning after he'd finished his breakfast, she performed her self-appointed task, till he came to look for her ministrations as much as he did for Thornton's. Nig, equally friendly, though less demonstrative, was a huge black dog, half bloodhound, half deerhound, with eyes that laughed in a boundless good nature. To Buck's surprise, these dogs manifested no jealousy toward him. They seemed to share the kindliness and largeness of John Thornton. As Buck grew stronger, they enticed him into all sorts of ridiculous games in which Thornton himself could not forbear to join. And in this fashion, Buck romped through his convalescence and into a new existence. Love, genuine, passionate love, was his for the first time. This he had never experienced as Judge Miller's down in the sun-kissed valley of Santa Clara. With the judge's sons hunting and tramping, it had been a working partnership, and with the judge's grandsons, a sort of pompous guardianship, and with the judge himself, a stately, dignified friendship. But love that was feverish and burning, that was adoration, that was madness, it had taken John Thornton to arouse. This man had saved his life, which was something, but further, he was the ideal master. Other men saw to the welfare of their dogs from a sense of duty and business expediency. He saw to the welfare of his as if they were his own children, because he could not help it. And he saw further. He never forgot a kindly greeting or a cheering word, and to sit down for a long time with them, gas is what he called it, was as much his delight as theirs. He had a way of taking Buck's head roughly between his hands and resting his own head upon Buck's, of shaking him back and forth, all the while calling him ill names that to Buck were love names. Buck knew no greater joy than that rough embrace and the sound of murmured oaths, and at each jerk back and forth it seemed that his heart would be shaken out of his body. So great was its ecstasy. And when released, he sprang to his feet, his mouth laughing, his eyes eloquent, his throat vibrant with unuttered sound, and in that fashion remained without movement. John Thornton would reverently exclaim, "God, you can almost speak." Buck had a trick of love expression that was akin to hurt. He would often seize Thornton's hand in his mouth and close so fiercely that the flesh bore the impress of his teeth for some time afterwards. And as Buck understood that the oaths to be love words, so the man understood this feigned or fake bite for a caress. For the most part, however, Buck's love was expressed as adoration. While he went wild with happiness when Thornton touched him or spoke to him, he did not seek these tokens. Unlike Skeet, who was wont to shove her nose under Thornton's hand and nudge till petted, or Nig, who would stalk up and rest his great head on Thornton's knee. Buck was content to adore at a distance. He would lie by the hour, eager, alert at Thornton's feet, looking up into his face, dwelling upon it, studying it, following with the keenest interest each fleeting expression, each moment or change of feature. Or, as chance might have it, he would lie further away, to the side or rear, watching the outlines of the man and the occasional movements of the body. And often, such was the communion in which they lived, the strength of Buck's gaze would draw John Thornton's head around, and he would return the gaze, without speech, his heart shining out of his eyes as Buck's heart shone out. For a long time after his rescue, Buck did not like Thornton to get out of his sight. From the moment he left the tent to when he entered it again, Buck would follow at his heels. His transient master, since he had come into the Northland, had bred in him a fear that no master would be permanent. He was afraid that Thornton would pass out of his life as Perrault and Francois and the Scotch half-breed had passed out. Even in the night, in his dreams, he was haunted by this fear. At such times, he would shake off his sleep and creep through the chill to the flap of the tent, where he would stand and listen to the sound of his master's breathing. But in spite of this great love he bore John Thornton, which seemed to bespeak the soft civilizing influence, the strain of the primitive, which the Northland had aroused in him, remained alive and active, faithful and devotion. Things born of fire and roof were his. Yet he retained his wildness and wiliness. He was a thing of the wild, come in from the wild to sit by John Thornton's fire, rather than a dog of the soft Southland stamped with the marks of generations of civilization. Because of his very great love, he could not steal from this man. But from any other man in any other camp, he did not hesitate an instant, while the cunning with which he stole enabled him to escape detection. His face and body were scored by the teeth of many dogs, and he fought as fiercely as ever and more shrewdly. Skeet and Nig were too good-natured for quarreling. Besides, they belonged to John Thornton. But the strange dog, no matter what the breed or valor, swiftly acknowledged Buck's supremacy or found himself struggling for life with a terrible antagonist, and Buck was merciless. He had learned well the law of club and fang, and he never forewent at an advantage or drew back from a foe he had started on the way to death. He had lessoned from Spitz and from the chief fighting dogs of the police and mail, and knew there was no middle course. He must master or be mastered. While to show mercy was a weakness, mercy did not exist in the primordial life. It was misunderstood for fear, and such misunderstandings made for death. Kill or be killed, eat or be eaten was the law, and this mandate, down out of the depth of time, he obeyed. He was older than the days he had seen and the breaths he had drawn. He linked the past with the present, and the eternity behind him throbbed through him with a mighty rhythm to which he swayed as the tides and seasons swayed. He sat by John Thornton's fire, a broad-breasted dog, white-fanged, long-furred, but behind him were the shades of all manner of dogs, half-wolves, wild wolves, urgent and prompting, tasting the savor of the meat he ate, thirsting for the water he drank, scenting the wind with him, listening with him and telling him the sounds made by the wildlife in the forest, dictating his moods, directing his actions, lying down to sleep with him when he lay down, and dreaming with him, beyond him, and becoming themselves the stuff of his dreams. Now, that was a very long sentence, and basically what it means is his ancestry, his wild heritage, is with him all the time, and especially when he dreams. So peremptorily did the shades beckon him that each day mankind and the claims of mankind slipped further from him. Deep in the forest, a call was sounding, And as often as he heard this call, mysteriously thrilling and luring, he felt compelled to turn his back upon the fire and the beaten earth around it and to plunge into the forest. And on, he knew not where or why, nor did he wonder where or why, the call, sounding imperiously deep in the forest. But as often as he gained the soft, unbroken earth and the green shade, the love for John Thornton drew him back to the fire again. Thornton alone held him. The rest of mankind was as nothing. Chance travelers might praise or pet him, but he was cold under it all, and from a too demonstrative man, he would get up and walk away. When Thornton's partners Hans and Pete arrived on the long-expected raft, Buck refused to notice them till he learned that they were close to Thornton. After that, he tolerated them in a passive sort of way, accepting favors from them as though he favored them by accepting. They were of the same large type as Thornton, living close to the earth, thinking simply and seeing clearly. And ere they swung the raft into the big eddy by the sawmill at Dawson, they understood Buck and his ways, and did not insist upon an intimacy such as obtained with Skeet and Nig. For Thornton, however, his love seemed to grow and grow. He, alone among men, could put a pack upon Buck's back in the summer traveling. Nothing was too great for Buck to do, when Thornton commanded. One day they had grub-staked themselves from the proceeds of the raft and left Dawson for the headwaters of the Tanana. The men and dogs were sitting on the crest of a cliff which fell away straight down to naked bedrock 300 feet below. John Thornton was sitting near the edge and Buck at the shoulder. A thoughtless whim seized Thornton, and he drew the attention of Hans and Pete to the experiment he had in mind. "Jump, Buck," he commanded, sweeping his arm out over the chasm. The next instant, he was grappling with Buck on the extreme edge, while Hans and Pete were dragging them back into safety. What has happened here is Thornton is testing Buck's loyalty to him, how much he trusts him. And so Thornton told him to jump off a cliff, and he was going to do it because he trusted him. "It's uncanny," Pete said after it was over and they had caught their speech. Thornton shook his head. "No, it is splendid. And it is terrible, too. Do you know, it sometimes makes me afraid." "I'm not hankering to be the man that lays hands on you when he's around," Pete announced conclusively, nodding his head toward Buck. "By jingo," was Hans' contribution. "Not myself either." It was at Circle City, ere the year was out, that Pete's apprehensions were realized. Black Burton, a man ill-tempered, malicious, had been picking a quarrel with a tenderfoot at the bar. That's somebody new to the area. When Thornton stepped good-naturedly between them, Buck, as was his custom, was lying in a corner, head on paws, watching his master's every action. Burton struck out without warning, straight from the shoulder. Thornton was sent spinning and saved himself from falling only by clutching the rail of the bar. Those who were looking on heard what was neither bark nor yelp, but something which is best described as a roar, and they saw Buck's body rise up in the air as he left the floor for Burton's throat. The man saved his life by instinctively throwing out his arm, but was hurled backward to the floor with Buck on top of him. Buck loosed his teeth in the flesh of the arm and drove in again for the throat. This time the man succeeded only in partly blocking, and his throat was torn open. Then the crowd was upon Buck, and he was driven off. But while a surgeon checked the bleeding, he prowled up and down, growling furiously, attempting to rush in and being forced back by an array of hostile clubs. A miners' meeting called on the spot decided that the dog had sufficient provocation, and Buck was discharged. But his reputation was made, and from that day, his name spread throughout every camp in Alaska. So we're learning a lot more about Thornton and about Buck and how he's not really missing the Southland anymore and his privileged life on the ranch in California. Okay, we'll finish up this chapter the next time. Bye-bye.